I'm Jane Alexander, Nantucket Book Festival alumna, welcoming you to At Home with Authors.
In March of 2017, Rob Cocuzzos and his father set off on a grueling 485-mile bike trip from Florence to the family's ancestral village of San Donato. Rob and his dad, Stephen, who are often mistaken for brothers, share an appetite for adventure sports. It's what drove Rob to spend 5 years pursuing the story of extreme skiing pioneer Doug Coombs for his book, Tracking the Wild Kumba. For the road to San Donato, Rob gave himself a 9-month deadline, which explains the book's dedication. For Vienna's Savoy, while your mother was making you, I was making this. Which, in a way, makes the road to San Donato a prologue to a father-daughter story. And thanks to Cocuzzos' curiosity, it reveals an episode in history that we can all pass down to our children. One that begins with the haunting memory of Mussolini's Italy embracing Nazi Germany and leads to an elderly shopkeeper in San Donato named Pasqualina Perella, who, when the Nazis came for the Jews, did what we hope we all would have the courage to do. On this episode of At Home with Authors, adventure writer, editor of N Magazine, author of The Road to San Donato, Rob Cocuzzos. Rob Cocuzzos, welcome. Welcome to At Home with Authors.
Thank you.
So you're in, where are you sitting right now?
I'm sitting in my apartment in Boston.
Okay. Well, it's a long way from Boston to San Donato.
Yeah, it is. All of this right here is the village, actually. It was painted. It was a wedding gift painted by Sergio Raffo, who's his sister is Delia Raffo, who was like our impromptu guide through that adventure.
I remember Delia, and I remember the whole crew because it is so fresh in my mind. Listen, I started reading it yesterday around 7 p.m. I could not stop. I couldn't put it down. And so the road to San Donato, fathers, sons, and cycling across Italy. You know, I expected a good journey because I know you're sort of an extreme adventurer, and we'll get into that. I expected some moving stories about fathers and sons. I didn't expect to learn so much history. And also, I learned so much about biking that I really felt like getting up out of bed last night and at least going down to my Peloton. I want to start actually with a quote that you picked up, and I almost don't want to give away anything about the journey, but I guess we can give away the idea that you made it to San Donato. So we have to let people know that. And there's a lot of wisdom in that little village in Italy. And one of them is a quote that I wrote down: "The art of the father is already half learned by the son." And because this is a story about fathers and sons, and you're a new parent, father of a daughter, take that quote and use that as the launching point. The art of the father is already half learned by the son.
Yeah, it's that quote was actually said by Fulvio Cocuzzos, who was a distant cousin of mine, my father's, who we met in the village. And he was talking about his relationship with his dad. And what I took that quote to understand is that there are inherent qualities that a son takes from their father. And so when it comes to the father's passion or their profession or, you know, whatever direction they take in their lives, those qualities are passed down kind of just through genetically. So you already have it within yourself. And I think that the road to San Donato, in a lot of ways for me personally, was about coming to terms with those things that were passed down to me from my father. And
so let me pause you there, because let's
Sure.
now start and dig in with your father. And in terms of what was passed down to you, this idea of, first of all, the type of bicycle your father rode and has ridden every day for several decades now. It's a type of bike that most of us are not familiar with, but it really, both metaphorically and literally.
So well said. Yep.
It has to do with what he has passed down to you. start with the bicycle and just take it from there.
So my dad rides what's called a fixed gear bicycle, and they're mostly used professionally on tracks. So people riding on a velodrome track, but they were taken over by bike messengers. And so whenever you see a cyclist zipping through traffic in the city with a package on their back, most likely they're riding a fixed gear bicycle. And what makes a fixed gear bicycle unique is that it's basically it's on one gear. So you can't coast, you can't stop pedaling. The pedals will always move as the wheels move. And it creates an incredible connection with the bicycle, but also opens you up to, a lot of dangerous situations, because if you think about it, the bike's going full speed, and if you go to stop pedaling, the pedals are going to keep on going. What makes it even more dangerous is the fact that the most hardcore fixed gear cyclists choose not to have a handbrake on the bike. They choose to use the strength of their legs to resist the forward momentum of the pedals and bring the bike to a stop. So my dad, I can't remember when he was exactly introduced to the fixed gear bicycle, but once he was introduced to it, he went full bore into it and immediately removed the removed the brake. And so on his daily commutes, he'd be riding, his 30 miles to work. He rides 5 miles to work, but 30 miles in total. He'd usually go for the exercise. But he would be weaving through traffic on this bike that had no brakes and was on one track. And over the course of, I guess since I was alive, he's been hit by 21 cars because the situations he would find himself in with this bike, and just by virtue of the traffic, would yield some significant challenges. And thankfully walked away from them all. But the bike itself just as you rightly noted, is a real great metaphor for my father's mentality, which is one gear, go full bore, and don't think about stopping unless you're actually forced to. And sometimes whether on the bike or whether in life, that stop comes by way of a crash.
And so, the first time I became even aware of you was when you were presenting at the Nantucket Book Festival about your earlier work, Tracking the Wild Kumba. Take us back to Tracking the Wild Kumba and that fixed gear mentality. How did that even put you in position? And how did that give you maybe the desire to track the wild Kumba? Tell us what Tracking the Wild Kumba was, by way of introducing our viewers and listeners to just who you are and what makes you tick.
Sure. Yeah. No. So I'd like to qualify myself as an adventure author. I came to Nantucket as I was a fishing guide on Nantucket, and I once took out this travel writer, and he handed me his business card and it said adventure writer. And I was like, wow, that is the coolest thing I'd ever heard of. And so that kind of set me on this course to figuring out how you actually become an adventure writer. And I won't bore you with all the details of kind of how I got to my book subject, but I ended up discovering the story of Doug Coombs, who was one of the biggest extreme skiers in the 80s and 90s. He basically pioneered heli skiing in Alaska and was an absolute superstar in ski films. I actually grew up watching him in ski films growing up and became really obsessed with his story. I moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming after college to kind of pursue my dream of living in a Western ski town. And I discovered that Doug Coombs came from the same area that I came from in Massachusetts and learned how to ski on the same hill that I learned how to ski on. So those parallels between our stories really presented a question to me, which was, how does Doug Coombs go from this little ski hill in Massachusetts to then becoming arguably the greatest skier of a generation? And to answer that question, I went on this 5-year quest in which I went to all of the ski towns and mountain villages that he kind of made his name. And I met the people that were in his life, and I skied the runs that he skied, or some of them, and basically try to piece together what drove him. And the reason why I had to do that process was that he was killed in an accident in 2006, trying to save the life of a young protege of his in France, in the French Alps. And so over the course of those years, I made my way to that village and had to kind of figure out what happened, had to meet the people that are with him on the day of the accident. And back to your point about the fixed gear bicycle, I think that where the parallel draws with me is that when I get kind of focused on a story, I find myself just driving forward, forward, forward. I mean, when I worked on that project, I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a publisher. I was funding the entire thing myself. So it was a lot of like, a seat would open up at a helicopter in Alaska, and the guy would say, if you come here in 2 days, we'll get you on it. I would just throw my credit card down and be there in 2 days. So it was just kind of this one track mind that I had to get it done, even though I didn't know where it was going to bring me. And I've taken that approach to all the big projects in my life. I think now I try to go about it a little more thoughtfully and, try to see where it's ultimately ending up. But that's definitely yeah.
As you were, sort of pushing and pushing to get to ultimately the source of where his life ended, I'm reminded of a quote in your book about extreme skiing. And the quote is, if you fall, you die. And so you have to ski and do anything when you're risking something like that with the utmost confidence. So where did you get that confidence from your father, or did it evolve over time with experience? And then we'll take the road to San Donato.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it comes a lot with experience and doing it, progressing up the curve, because there's no way you could go from, where I started to where I ended in one kind of swift motion. It was a lot of hours of doing it. And but you do need a certain bold attitude to put yourself in those situations. You need to be comfortable summoning, a kind of a superhuman level of confidence to execute some of these things where, just as you described, if you fall, you die. You need to be able to kind of get yourself in a headspace where you're just focusing on each individual movement, knowing that you've done it before and trying not to psych yourself out.
So now let me say, if you fall, you die. And I'm looking at that painting over your left shoulder, and I'm thinking, well, that trip that you describe in the road to San Donato, I was never concerned about you and your father falling. We were trying to figure out, how are you going to make it up those hills, those steep hills? And it's not just that one steep hill in back of you, or that mountain. It was day after day. What was it, like 60 to 80 miles a day?
Yeah.
Many of those miles on that kind of incline. So, and there were times when you seemed to you expressed it. You lost your confidence. You thought this was it.
Right.
Tell us about the biking. And for those of us who just want to listen to you and get pumped up for today's workout, just tell us about the bike adventure and maybe that one pivotal moment where you thought you weren't going to make it and somehow you did.
Right. Well, so I started this whole trip completely ill-equipped physically to do it. I remember there's a scene in the book where I remember we just got our bicycles, and I throw my leg over the bike, and I catch a glimpse of myself in one of the car windows, and I look like this overstuffed sausage in my bike outfit. Like my bike outfit, the zip little item, it looked like it still had the creases in it from the bag that I got it out of. So I was not prepared. I'm an athlete, but I hadn't really trained. Meanwhile, my father, as you said, he was cycling to work and doing all these miles. So he was prepared, but neither of us were prepared for the hills like you described. I mean, over the course of that trip, we had climbed enough vertical feet to reach the summit of Everest. And on the first day, we just kind of had a big slice of humble pie. We were halfway up, we're halfway through the day. I had gotten us completely lost. And I remember seeing my dad. My dad was sitting over on the curb in this no-name village outside of Florence. And I felt, on one hand, this deep sense of failure, having kind of gotten us lost. And then the other real sense of self-doubt on whether we were actually going to be able to complete this big trip. And I think that what I learned through the course of that cycling adventure is you just have to focus on the next pedal stroke. Just like that's as long as you keep your scope in that small little space between your legs where you're like, okay, 1, 2, 1, 2. you'll eventually get to where you're going. But it's once you like, if you pan out too much and you think, oh my gosh, I have 60 miles today, 80 miles tomorrow, another 80 miles the next day, and it just becomes too overwhelming to, to want to proceed. So you kind of have to just aim small. I think this book really is. It's an exploration of the relationship between parents and their children. And I was in a unique position to write this book while I was preparing to become a dad myself. And I got this signed on with my publisher right as my wife discovered that she was pregnant. And I told the publisher I was going to set the due date or the deadline on her due date. And so for 9 months, I worked every morning on this book about my dad, basically, and to reflect on his life and his decisions and the time that we spent together while I was also trying to prepare to become a dad myself. Just put everything in a totally different perspective. I understood the stresses that he must have experienced on those various chapters of my childhood. And I could kind of empathize with him more than I could as just a son. Now that I was becoming a dad, I could kind of understand it better. So that's really what this book's about, is trying to kind of peel layers of the onion off of the relationships that are closest to you. And so I hope when people read the book, they're prompted to look around their own lives and think about, some of the questions that they might have for folks that are so close to them, and yet in reality, they're really far apart.
Your father's a very cool guy, and I want to show a couple of pictures of him because he's a guy who didn't have a lot of ink on his body a few years back, but then sort of decided to get one tattoo and another and another. My father grew up in a mostly Italian neighborhood in New York, very, very poor. And so when we were living a more comfortable life than when he was, he couldn't leave those poverty-stricken roots. So when I would go to get my hair cut at a place like your father's, my father would expect the more money you paid for a haircut, the more hair they should cut. And yet your father, who was an artist, right? I mean, he's an artist of the head. And
we'd like to say, yeah.
Yes. And he actually, there was a scene in your book where he sort of encouraged you, right, to keep your hair long.
Oh, yeah.
Which fascinated me that, he was, but describe, listen, paint a picture for those of us who are about to read the book. Just paint a portrait of your father for us.
What a great question. So my dad, I think easily put, is a 67-year-old heavily tattooed hairdresser who is an extreme athlete. He does everything to the max. He really doesn't have an off switch. He's an endorphin junkie. He doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't eat meat, but he pushes his body to the absolute limit. Like, that's how he gets his highs. So he's programmed his entire life around his passions for athletic endeavors. He ran 23 Boston marathons. Now, he only took 2 years off when my brother was born and when I was born. He rides hundreds of miles on his bike. He's just a physical specimen, but he's totally in addition to getting his highs on his bike, he also gets kind of a certain thrill and rush out of just defying the conventionality of life. And he instilled that in me. I mean, when you kind of reference the idea of me not cutting my hair, I mean, he never wanted me to look like anyone else. He never wanted me to think like anyone else. And that worked kind of double-edged sword. I mean, in one way that did inspire me to, cut my own trail. But other times I just wanted to have like a regular dad, like a regular guy with a briefcase and the 9 to 5. And instead, my dad was always looked at like my older brother. And so I had a unique childhood in that respect.
The fact that you were not yet engaged, right? When you set off on this journey, you were
I was preparing to propose.
You can't even use stumbled. You stuttered over the word propose. The only word you've ever stuttered over. So you were preparing for it, and your wife, who is Jewish, and you were sort of wrestling with this idea of you coming from a devout Catholic background,
right?
Marrying, maybe proposing to a Jewish woman, and then already thinking about how are you going to raise your kids, and looking for that narrative that maybe you could, that would make sense of it all.
Yes.
And so, like, I'm reading that and I'm relating to it. And then World War II comes into your story. And how does it come into your story? Not through some book about World War II, back to the bicycle,
Right. Yeah.
through a bicyclist who was one of the greatest cyclists ever,
Mm-hmm.
whose name I and most of our readers will discover through you. So tell us about that, and how this late cyclist, was the key holder for you to discover this incredible history of World War II, and the relationship between certain Italians and certain Jews that will give us all heart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So prior to my trip, my dad had given me a book about Gino Bartali, who, as you just described, was this incredible, just a legendary cyclist, had won the Tour de France, won the Giro d'Italia. I mean, he was the guy. He was the Lance Armstrong before the fall of Lance Armstrong. I mean, he was the national hero. And with the rise of Mussolini often cherry-picked these athletes to serve as kind of these figureheads for his regime. You know, he had this machismo. He really wanted the strong, archetype to be front and center in like true propagandist fashion. And so he was picking these particular athletes and wanted Gino Bartali to serve in that role. But Gino refused. He didn't want to have anything to do with fascism. And that kind of set the stage for what would happen with the rise of fascism, and how they subjugated and put thousands of Italian Jews and foreign Jews that found their way into Italy into internment camps throughout the country. Gino ended up, as I discovered in the book I read, and then from my trip and doing the research, Gino acted heroically during the war. Because he was such a well-known figure, he could cycle around the country without being stopped by any of the fascist guards or later members of the Nazi Party. And so what he would do is he would use that ability to pass through these checkpoints to his advantage. And he ended up smuggling documents that were identifications for Jews to be able to get out of the country in his bicycle. And he would ferry them from where they're being forged to where the Jews were waiting to pick them up.
And tell us how he hid those documents, because that's fascinating.
Yeah, so he rolled them up and he put them in the frame of his bicycle. Because he would just have two water bottles and his jersey, and then, his frame, they never would go to check the frame. They never really checked him because they knew who he was. And so it was more about getting his autograph. But what he would also do, he hid a family in one of his houses and brought them food. I mean, he just did these remarkable acts that never came to light until much later. I think it was in 2000 when the story started coming forward, and his son started telling some of the stories. But it was kind of in Gino Bartali's mind, you didn't talk about the good you did. And he didn't even look at himself as a real hero compared to some of the other more valiant acts. But as I was learning the story of Gino Bartali, even before then, I was conflicted about the Italian history during World War II, because we get so focused, and in some cases rightfully so, on what Germany did, but we don't think as much about what was happening in Italy with Mussolini, because Mussolini, basically made it his mission to become Hitler's best friend. And, in Florence, he toured him through Florence. There were swastikas hanging from all the buildings. I mean, if you see the footage of it, it's disgraceful. And I, started feeling a certain shame about that history. And even before the rise of Hitler, Italy has this long history of putting Jews in the ghetto. I mean, they had this horrible kind of history of they go back years, mistreating the Jewish population, which was one of the oldest in Europe. I didn't even know that. So I felt this certain amount of shame about, this is like what my country, my so-called, my my heritage was doing during that time. And the story of Gino put a little glimmer of light in that. And then when we got to the village, obviously that light became far more luminous.
And tell us about that, because even as it became more luminous, you had this nagging
absolutely.
question. So tell us about what you learned about the role of San Donato in this episode during World War II, where the Nazis were coming to round up the Jews.
Right.
And I mean, boy, you got there just in the nick of time to meet some of the heroes, one of them in particular, in person.
Yes. So just as I was describing before, there were a number of these kind of internment camps set up throughout a lot of the mountainous regions of Italy, where Italian Jews as well as foreign Jews were gathered, taken out of cities like Florence, and then put into these villages. And San Donato Val di Camino was one of these locations. When the Nazis came to occupy Italy, and just as you said, they came and they basically wanted a list of where all the Jews were going to come get them. And so they saw San Donato, they went to San Donato, and when they got there, there's one big problem. The Jews were nowhere to be found. And the reason for that was the villagers had bound together to hide them in their homes, hide them in the mountainsides. And in this case that you just alluded to, some were given forged identifications. So I had the great fortune and really honor, to meet the woman who was forging the identifications. She was in her 90s when I met her, but she was 18, I believe, when all this was happening. And she had gotten a job in the town administrative office, which actually was called the House of Fascism, because that's where all the fascists ended up headquartering. And so under their noses, she was forging identifications for these various Jews that were interned there, and helped save a number of lives, many of the descendants of whom had come back to actually see her. But when I learned about this history, I also learned that there were members of the village that were sympathizers or just straight up fascists that were made it their goal to try to give up these people and try to out the ones that were saving them. And so when I learned about these two histories, these two kind of events happening, I was immediately struck with the concern about what my family's role was during this time. Because if they had given up people, or they were sympathizers, or did anything on the bad side of history, I didn't know what that would mean for my future family. I mean, I was prepared to get married. We had decided that we were going to raise our daughter Jewish, or we weren't pregnant at the time, but we were going to raise our children Jewish. So it was it weighed on me enormously. And that became my mission, was I need to find out, what my family did and what role they played. And thankfully, they had no role in giving anyone up, weren't sympathizers. They were resistors in their own way. But it made me ponder about what we do with the kind of back to that art of the father. Like, what do we do with those inheritances that we can't really control? Because they were direct descendants of the fascists that were in the village during that time. I mean, there was one person in there, his name was Benito. I mean, he was known to be the grandson of one of the biggest fascists in town. And, how does he live his life without?
That's so fascinating to me, because, as we're talking and speaking in this country about the divide, the fact that you have a little village, which is, such a social place. I mean, people are out socializing all the time with each other. The fact that you would have the proud descendants of fascists and the proud descendants of the resistors in that same village. Did you get a sense of how that even works?
It seems like the descendants of the fascists aren't proud anymore. At least the grandson has tried to reconcile that history and put some distance with it. I actually tried to talk to that individual, but I was dissuaded from doing so, which I came to kind of understand why you wouldn't want that type of light focused on you. But I think that there's definitely, you draw such a great parallel with today, how we're supposed to coexist when there's such ideological differences. But they've seemed to, with time, be able to reconcile.
It's so interesting because now I'm really fixated on that painting over your shoulder, because one of the reasons you point out, I mean, you really gave us an incredible history lesson, but you said one of the reasons that San Donato was chosen as an internment place was there was only one way into the village and one way out. And we can see that above your left shoulder.
Right.
And some of the descriptions, you gave us and that you learned really from primary sources who
Right.
were
Yeah.
still alive, and also from the archives of of just what the experience was for some of these Jews who had to actually sort of hide in the mountains during the winter.
Unbelievable.
I mean, just tell us a little bit as we look over your shoulder. That's more of probably a spring or a summertime
Right.
scene there. But
Yeah. I mean, we
what
were,
did you learn when you were there?
yeah, I mean, just, we were there in the spring, and yet it was still a cold place to be. I mean, you're in the mountains. And so part of our daily routine was to cycle up into the mountains, because there is, just as you said, there's one way in and one way out. If the one way in is going up the hill, and then the one way out keeps on going up the hill. So we continue to go up, and you're looking into, these various little areas where people were, sleeping in caves, and basically depending upon the villagers to come up to give them food and clothing. And I mean, it was absolutely brutal conditions to try to survive. It actually defies the imagination on how they were able to manage. And then you had, I mean, isolated acts of heroism, in which there was one story that I detailed in the book where
The doctor.
yes, the doctor and his wife left their children with one of the villagers.
So this was a Jewish doctor and his wife, and
Correct. Yeah.
How old was their daughter?
Was that
How old was their daughter?
her daughter? The daughter at the time, I believe, was 3 years old. Because the daughter was born, I'm not right on that, 2 or 3. It was very, very young girl. I mean, it was really hard for the family to just go up into the hills. And so much so that the mother ended up showing up at the front door and saying, I need to see my kid. And the person that was hiding the daughter pulled her right in and said, you gotta get out of sight, because the fascists are all over here. And sure enough, the fascists showed up and wanted to search the house. They were banging on the door. They were posted outside, and they needed to figure out a way to get this woman out of the village and back up into hiding. And what they ended up doing was putting her in a basket and covering her, covering her like a blanket, and then putting manure on top of her. And then another woman carried this person on her head past the checkpoint. And the village is this like stony jungle gym. I mean, it's stairs, and just walking there without carrying anything is a task. To carry another human being on your head, where if you drop her, you're probably going to get shot. And I think what struck me, and it goes back to the question you posed earlier about what would I have done? It's easy for us to think that we're going to act a certain way, because I think rightfully so, we venerate those type of heroes. But you have to remember, like, what the actual circumstances were. They were in this teeny little village in the middle of absolute nowhere. They have no reason whatsoever to put their lives on the line. They don't know these people. They don't have like any familial connection with them. There's not like, there's no, CNN Heroes Award. Like there's no recognition. You're basically putting your life on the line out of a deep and true, sincere sense of what's right and what's wrong. That's it. And, I think that, to answer that question, well, what would I have done? We don't know until we're tested, and I think that a lot of people in that village, they rose to the moment, and they were guided by a lot of internal, an internal compass. But yeah, I mean, when I was sitting with the woman that was forging identifications, you do feel like you're in the presence of something that's, for lack of a better word, like holy, superhuman.
Yeah, it was incredible to think of, and you sort of, rightly put the spotlight on the fact that she was 18 years old, just 18 years old, living at home, risking her life and her family's life.
Yeah, I mean, they're in the, it just, yeah, I just, it's remarkable. I mean, you think about, if you just kind of just like can imagine being in that village during that time period where people were, fast troops coming to door, kicking it right in, dragging your whole family out. And yet you continue to do this,
And you know,
knowing that it could
you
cost
know,
you your life.
I'm sorry I interrupted you. And as you're telling me her story, and the way you describe her, this 95-year-old woman who had a very, very firm handshake, and
Yeah.
and then there's this the little thing I highlighted from your book, that there's an expression in San Donato: do good and forget about it, but do bad and you'll always remember. And maybe that sort of gets at, what explains people's willingness to do good when they get no credit, when there's no light shining on them,
100%. I mean, I think that probably goes back to the Gina Bartali, his motivation and his, what we would describe as modesty. For him, it's just that this is what he did. He's not looking for any accolades.
So let me ask you before we wrap up, because there are so many images. I mean, this was a very vivid book. And I know you took some photographs because you're a photographer too. Are there any particular images, sort of signature images, that you feel you got that you would, are you going to put together a scrapbook for your daughter when the time comes?
Yeah. Right.
And what image would you show her first?
Well, that's such a great question, because, what I did was, this book, this whole adventure was a tribute to my grandfather, as it turned out. And so I ended up putting together this kind of a slideshow of all the images. And it was really fun to watch the evolution of my dad and I over the course of that time, because you see us, starting out completely, look cleanly shaven, the whole thing. And then at the end of it, we're like these two ragamuffins, with our clothes are barely fitting because we're so skinny from the ride. So I'd probably take one photo from the beginning with my dad and I drinking coffee, then the one at the end, we're drinking coffee again together, and just shows that, like, in the course of 2 weeks, we both just had this incredible evolution. And then I would show a photo of the monument right there with kind of the angel reaching up to heaven with the mountains in the background. I feel like that's a real iconic photo. And we'll eventually bring my daughter there. She actually came. She came in utero, because I went back to do some follow-up research. My wife was 7 months pregnant at the time, and so we went back, and those guys at the cafe table were sitting there, wearing the same clothes, smoking the same cigarettes. It was like the place had not changed. So those would be the images I'd probably share. I will. Yeah, I want to bring her back. I mean, one of my things about thinking about being a parent is, wanting to guide her through all these adventures too.
One of the beautiful things about this book, you weren't heavy-handed about it. You were just being very transparent, and suddenly, the conversation about mental health came up in your narrative. And, you talked about depression that you had suffered since you were, I guess, from 18 onward, and then talking to your father about that. And it's actually very endearing, his responses to you, even though he didn't quite get the distinction between clinical depression and really intense anxiety, but it was really beautiful. And, you sort of described that in detail. And I just wonder, for those, for people who suffer, from depression or anxiety disorders, watching the joy in your telling of this story, and, joy and depression can coexist, not necessarily at the very same moment,
right?
But how have you evolved, both during the trip to San Donato and after?
I think that's such a great question for you to ask, because it is one of the big takeaways that I'm trying to have in this book. For me, it's been a journey of trying to figure out all the different things to tinker with in my life that create a greater degree of balance. So that includes having someone to talk to regularly, which I think everyone needs. I mean, whether you feel like you struggle with anxiety, depression, or any other mental health issue, everyone needs to have someone that they can talk to and just vent to without feeling like there's any expectation of you need to take care of that person. I mean, to have someone that can just hear you out and give you some guidance is such a valuable resource. And that can come in all sorts of forms, whether it be a therapist or a life coach. So that's one thing. For me, exercise, diet. I don't drink. I think that found is a source for me as a depressant. It just drove me down. So I found if I eliminated that, that really elevated me generally. And then I become in the last year very much into meditation and mindfulness practice. So the person I talk to weekly is actually a meditation teacher, and so I've been working on that, which I've found to be hugely helpful. But the biggest thing is just to be honest with yourself. Don't feel any shame. Ask for help. I mean, it's a journey. For me, it continues to be a journey. I don't think that I've arrived to the absolute equilibrium, because there are certainly times where it's like, oh, I'm down there again. But with those subtle changes, I've found that you can extend the levels of being balanced longer. And when you do drop into the darkness, it's not nearly as dark as it once was. But I do want to close on this point with one thing, just for all the folks that do have those feelings out there. I think the most empowering thing is to know that you are not alone in those feelings. The majority of people have them. And the more that we can have this open dialogue about it, it's just that would do us all a ton of good, just to be, have this kind of candor and realizing it's like any other health related issue, and there should be no sense of shame about it. It is what it is.
Let me ask you a final question. So do you have any books on the horizons or any stories? I actually host a podcast called Wavemaker Conversations, a podcast for the insanely curious. And so I really connected to your approach, because if you hadn't had that insane curiosity, you wouldn't have brought out anywhere near the amount of insights and stories you did. And your curiosity clearly drives you to like ends of the earth. Where is your curiosity driving you now?
So I've got a few projects going on. I write memoirs for private clients. So I basically ghostwrite biographies for clients. That's kind of one side of my brain. Obviously working on stories for the magazines that I edit. And then I'm working on television series and new book ideas. I mean, a lot of just kind of keeping digging. I mean, it's the writing profession is one that you need to continue to reinvent yourself. And maybe not reinvent yourself, but reinvent your thinking and just continue to try to see what you can do with this craft. And so I don't have the subject matter for my next book picked out quite yet. I know that I'm prepared to write it. I wasn't prepared to write it over the last year. I think once you finish a book, you put it out to the world, especially one where it's like very personal, you kind of need some time. And so I took that time. And I know that I'm ready to write. So I'm looking forward to that next topic, but I have nothing to share quite yet.
Well, Rob Cocuzzos, author of The Road to San Donato. Anybody who reads this book, forevermore, when people talk about the Cocuzzos of San Donato, they're gonna know it. They're gonna be able to tell the whole history. It's a great story, a great book, and thank you for joining us on At Home with Authors.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been a delight.